In this lesson, we'll be building a menu that contains a sub-menu that will navigate the playhead around the main timeline. And of course, the menu will be contained within a movie clip, so it will be controlling it from within that movie clip. I think I'll just do a test movie right now and show you what I mean, and then I'll go around and show you how it was built. So right now I'm just going to click on test here. And what we have here is just some static text items. I do have a gradient as the background that you can see here as gradient sky, and I'm going to want you to create the gradient as well. And then our main feature here, which is the menu. So the idea here is when I mouse over that big pink button, which again is using a radial gradient, and I'm going to want you to create one almost exactly like you see it here. So you will have to use your gradient tool for this, as well as the gradient in the color palette. We start here by mousing over, and it does create a sub-menu, and the sub-menu happens to be the two circles running outside. So those are actually two sets of buttons right now inside of the movie clip on frame 2. And when I mouse over the inner circle, if you will, it goes darker as a mouse over, just a plain mouse over feature. But the bigger circle, I actually want you to animate it in the mouse over state so that it does sort of fluctuate from one color back to another color, and it's seamless. So it's kind of pulsating with the color going from one color to another color and then back to the original color. So that would have to be a seamless loop inside of the overstate inside of that button. Okay, and I will show you how these were built, but let's just click away, and when we move out, there is an invisible button on the outer rim, if you will, which triggers the menu back to frame 1 within the menu, and that's what creates the illusion of it going off and on. Okay, so when I roll over that inside of the menu movie clip, we're actually going to frame 2, just like in our last exercise when we created the menu with the yellow squares. Okay, so let me just click on some of these guys here, because we're also incorporating sound. It's a big part of it as well here. So when I click on here, I am getting the beep sound. So the beep sound would have been put in the down state as a keyframe inside of that button. And I'm also, just as a graphic, I'm getting you to put a rectangle with a rainbow of various colors on the screen. Let's go back here and we'll navigate to the outer button. And here you will create a movie clip that contains the long sound, which is the song that I've included in the downloads, and you'll animate a progress bar. And I will show you how that works. This is a movie clip. So if you're looking on the timeline here, under song, that movie clip appears under frame 10 here. Okay, let me just go back and click on the first one. So when I press down on that first button, it does change the graphic, and it also navigates me back to frame 1 here. And thirdly, and very importantly, it also cancels out the sound. Let me just play that again here. So if I go here and I'm playing the sound, if I click on either the big round button or the alternate circular button, the sound does get canceled out. It does get stopped. Okay, so that's again a part of this exercise, is to stop the sound when clicking a button to go somewhere else. Okay, so that's what we're going to create ultimately. So let me close this demo and I'll go through how it was built. Okay, so I will start on the main timeline here and explain a little bit of the construction, and then ultimately start one from scratch, I think. What we have here are 6 layers. The top layer is for the actions, it's for the code, and that should always be on the top. And I'll actually briefly explain why that is. When these files download off the internet, when we output the SWF file, the top layer loads last. It loads from the bottom up. So if you think of the logic of that, you would want the code to load last, because if it loads first, it's going to try to execute the code. And if some of the other elements haven't loaded yet, it will run into errors because it's looking for things that are not there yet. So if everything else is loaded before the code loads, you will avoid that potential issue. So again, the reason we put actions on the top is because the top layer loads last. It loads from the bottom and incrementally towards the top. Okay, and as you can see here also, there's a little letter A in that first frame. That's where my code sits. So that A, I'll just remind you, represents a frame with code. Now the next layer down, I've used it for my navigation purposes, and I've put a frame label on each of the three keyframes here. I've got a keyframe on frame 1, I've got a keyframe on frame 5, and I've got one on frame 10. And I'll be honest, I've just spanned these out so it's a little easier to see and to demonstrate. This could have been done with 3 frames, just so you know. But I spanned them out. There's no harm. It doesn't affect the playback of the movie because nothing is actually animating on the root timeline, on the scene 1 timeline, which is usually a best practice. We typically animate things inside of movie clips. And that's the case here. We have 2 major movie clips. One is the menu itself, which I'll click on the stage here. And that has its own dedicated layer. I've called it nav. And it's persistent, meaning that the one keyframe is spanned throughout the whole movie. Therefore, that element will always be present in the movie. Okay? The other main movie clip I have is on frame 10 here. And that's that progress bar with the music playing. And you can see here that it has got its own dedicated layer as well, called song. And as we get to frame 10, that's when it appears, right? The little empty circle there means there's no content on the stage in that layer until it encounters the dark circle, which is a keyframe. And again, when the circle's filled in and the span is a lighter color, it's telling you that there's actual content on the stage in that particular layer. Okay, you probably knew all of this, but it's good to know, good to refresh. Now this other layer down below here is called graphics, and it's really just for these page titles, if you will. So I've got one there called page 3, and if I go over here to frame 5, I've got one called page 2, and finally on the first frame I've got 2, one called page 1, and I want you to actually put your name in there. So I'm going to officially do that. And if I run out of space, well actually this was a point text, so it's going to fill in the line anyway. But I want you to put your name, your full name right there, please, on page 1. Okay. Let's see, on the timeline, I think that pretty well explains the timeline, just recapping. Code on the top, frame labels on layer number 2, so you'll need to keyframe the 3 frames. The navigation, which is the menu. 1 keyframe, persistent throughout the whole movie. Next layer down is what I've called the song, which on frame 10, when we send our playhead to page 3, that movie clip will become visible, and whatever's inside of it will begin to play. Down here again, graphics are these page labels, and then the last one at the bottom here is gradient sky. I just to practice our gradient exercise a little more. I'm getting you to use gradients a little more in this assignment. Okay. Now let me just show you how that was created quickly here. I'll actually delete it and do it again. So if I highlight that, I'll go delete. Oh, let me undo that. Now that was interesting. I think that's a new feature in this version actually. When I was on this frame, when I hit delete, it actually just deleted to that spot, which, interesting, it didn't used to do that. So I'm glad I did that. So if you're in the latest 2020 version, which I'm in right now, make sure your playhead is over top of the keyframe, right there. And again, now I can select that on the stage and just delete it. And you'll notice this went dark, meaning there's no current content in the layer right now. So I'm just going to go and use my rectangle tool. And maybe I'll just reset the colors here just so you know how to sort of begin with a normal color. I'm going to keep the stroke set to none. All right, stroke was set to none, and I will retain that. Color here is just a starting point, so it really doesn't matter too much what it is. So I'm just going to draw a rectangle a little bit larger than the stage size, and ultimately this will become my gradient. So I start by creating the square. Very importantly, be aware of which frame was selected when you create the stuff on the stage, because you don't want to be plunking it in the wrong layer. You want to make sure that you've selected that first frame in the intended layer called gradient sky. So I will click it on the stage now. And really it's 2 steps. One is the color palette, and then ultimately I will use the gradient tool. But we'll start with the color palette and establish a linear gradient. Now it will take on the colors of the previous gradient, and that's why I see these colors that I've been previously using. But the idea here is that you, again, with the little markers at the bottom here. You just click on it and you can select a color. And it will update live on the stage. And I'm going to keep my colors close here because I already liked what I had, and I'm just going to move them a bit. But you can move the tone in the big box and the hue in the sliders here. Okay, so I'll just go back to there. Now, this is cool. I got the gradient I wanted, except it's going in the wrong direction. It's going from left to right, and I want the darker color to be at the top and the lighter color to be at the bottom. So that's where I need to go to my gradient tool to rotate the gradient. So the gradient tool is nested with the free transform tool. If you don't see it topmost, it's nested with the free transform tool. So gradient tool, there we go. And as you saw in the gradient exercise, we have a rotate button. I can reduce that ramp, and I can actually move it inside like it's sort of in a masked area. But what I want to do is I'll just simply squish this a bit because I know the top to bottom is shorter. And then I'll go to the rotate. Now if I hold my shift key down, it will snap to 45 degrees, which is convenient. And there we go. Now if I want to stretch that back out and make it smoother or more intense, I can do that by grabbing that slider and moving it around. I'm going to leave it right there and click away. And I'm just going to save. You should save every time you've accomplished a step, basically. So that's how I created the gradient in the background. The text, I'm going to trust that you know how to click your text tool and generate text. But just to go over it, you can highlight it. And in your properties, you can change the fonts and the sizes and the styles and so on. I'm using a font called Impact. It's really good for display. It's bold. And it's just one of my favorites for demonstration purposes. Use any font you want. Just make sure it fits and looks reasonable. Same idea for the text box here. And I'll remind you, these are all static text as well. Let's work on the progress bar first, then we'll save the navigation for last. First thing I want to do though is, make sure that your main timeline, your scene 1 timeline, looks similar to mine, is set up the same. You can have different lengths of spans, but I definitely want the 3 keyframes with the labels and the labels there. And just to remind you, to create a label, you select the keyframe. In your properties, you type in a label here. And I called that page 01, PG01. And I'll just hit my enter key. And you should see it represented in your timeline by the name and the red flag. Okay, so let's move over to frame 10. And let me just show you how this was built. So again, it's a movie clip on the main timeline, right? I did import a sound, so I went to File, Import, Import to Library. And these are the downloads, and that's the song. If you want to use your own music, go ahead. But this is the one I've provided, awareness22.mp3. And I clicked open. I'm not going to click open because I already have it in my library, as I'll show you right here. Okay. So import that so you have it prepared. Now let's go inside of this movie clip. I'll show you how it's built, and then I'll actually rebuild it here from scratch. Okay. So I'll just reduce my frames here. Basically 3 layers. One for the sound, one for the black border up here, and one for the green fill. So let me just zoom ahead to the end here. Actually, I'll just show you in frame 1 of the sound, just to remind you, we set our sound into properties. And for the long sounds, you do need to set it to stream. Okay, so pick the sound, set it to stream, leave everything else at their default settings. Now if I go all the way to the end here, and you can see I'm running into the 3,000, almost 3,000 frames. I'm at 2580 here. Let's see if I just expand this a bit. I just want to be able to see the keyframes here. Okay, there we go. So there's one keyframe at the end here. This green bar, if I drag it here, you will hear the sound too if it's loud enough, is the animation. I'm going to shrink this now, ironically, is the animation of that bar going from left and then expanding itself to the right. So what I had done was I'd keyframed the last frame when it was still full. You know, I drew a rectangle with a green fill and a black stroke. Selected the black stroke and cut it. Edit cut. Went to the new layer. Went to frame 1, edit, paste in place. And I will demonstrate that when I create it, but that's how it was created. And of course, these were all matched to match the duration of the song, which I had to push out, which is the painstaking part of the process, until I saw that line disappear, basically. Now, if I push it out further here, I'm going to click away once and move my playhead near the end, but not on the end, because I don't want to push the last keyframe out. I can see that it had ended there, so I think I just pulled it back a bit. So that's what you're looking for when you're spanning out your sound, and you should do that first. Okay, but that's how it's built. So let me just build a second one here. I'm going to go back to scene 1. And I will put it on the same layer. I'm going to build a second one. So you're going to see 2, if you will. And how I started was I went to frame 10. I went to my rectangle tool. I picked my colors. So my stroke, I chose black. And right now my stroke is set to 4, so I'm good with that. My fill, I just picked the bright green. And that's how I started. Okay, fill and stroke, black with green fill. All right, now on my rectangle tool, I just came in and I just literally drew that rectangle. I need to turn that into a movie clip. So once I've created my rectangle, I'm going to create a movie clip, which will basically nest this inside of the movie clip. So that's the next step after creating the rectangle. We turn it into a movie clip. So I go modify, convert to symbol, movie clip, and I'm just going to call this song bar. Okay, so I've got my movie clip called song bar, and that's what it's called in the library, song bar. And I'm going to go into it now by double clicking it. And it's here where I'll make the 3 layers, one for the song, one for the frame border, and one for the fill, which will animate. So I'm going to name them all. I'm going to start by naming this fill. You know what? I'm going to give it a long name so it's clear. Animated fill. Okay, and I'll create a new layer on top of that. We'll call that the stroke. And I'll create another new layer, which can go on the top or the bottom. It's for the song. And we'll just name that song. Okay, I'll drag that to the bottom just because. Now, with respect to the animated fill, I need to separate the line and put it on the stroke layer. So let's go in here. I'll just actually deselect by clicking away here. Double click on that stroke line, cut it, edit cut, and then come up to the stroke layer, and this is very important to select that specific frame. That's the designated place for it to land, and I'll go edit, paste in place, and that drops it exactly in the same location. So if I hide this, you see that the stroke's on that layer. If I hide this, you see the fill is on that layer. So I'm just going to span this out. It doesn't matter right now, but I'll say to 30. I'm going to drag downwards on frame 30 on all 3 layers and hit F5 on my keyboard, which is the shortcut for spanning. So now all of these 3 elements exist over 30 frames. I still need to put the song in, the sound for the song, so I'm going to go to that frame now. Frame 1. And on my properties, under sound, I will choose awareness 22. And very importantly, make sure sync is set to stream. Okay, that's really critical. All right, you know what? It's probably a good time to save here. I'm just going to save on the keyboard. There we go. And the idea here is to animate this green fill to match the duration of the song. So I'm going to show you a cool trick. We can actually do most of that work in these 30 frames, and then we just push the whole thing out to seek the end of the song. So I'll start by right-clicking on my animated fill layer and create a shape tween, because I'm just animating a raw vector shape here. Create shape tween. Then I will go to the last frame and keyframe it F6. There we go. And then I'll go back to frame 1 and just with my transform tool, shrink to a sliver on the left. Now, to reduce this green fill and keep it sort of anchored to the left, when I start stretching it here, I will need to hold down my Option key on the Mac, Alt key on the PC. Otherwise, if I just try to resize it, resizes on its center point. But if I click down on the Alt key, it suddenly anchors to the left. And what we want to do is want to make this very small, just a sliver like you see there. And let me just demonstrate how this animates, because right now it's just over 30 frames, so it'll be fairly dramatic. And you see how that animates, and it will, when it gets to the last frame, it will fill the box. So logically, when we get to the end of the song, it will stay synced visually. Like at halfway through the song, the bar will literally be at the halfway point. And all I need to do to actually fulfill this is to push all of these 3 frames out for the duration of the song. Now this song is almost 3,000 frames long, but I'll show you how we can do this. I'm going to reduce this a bit. Because there's a keyframe on the end, I'm going to put my playhead a few frames before, and then just make sure no layers are selected, so click away here, or no frames are selected, just click away in an empty area. And if I hit F5, you see how it pushes those frames out, all of them, across the whole timeline. And that's what we want to do. Now you can hold the key down, and I'll just explain the reason I did not put the playhead on the last frame is then it would have just expanded that keyframe and not the animation. Okay, so that's why I'm a few frames ahead. It could be over here, it doesn't matter. But you can also hear when you scrub, you can hear the sound, by the way. So right there, I'm just going to hold down F5 and push it through. And at this point, I'm going to probably edit the video and come back and magically be up around 3,000. Okay, so here we go. I'm about to jump into the future. Okay, here I am in the future. Okay, I'm just going to keep pushing with the F5 here. And you'll see that orange line suddenly disappear, which represents the end of the sound. So I can go back here, but I think I'm fine the way it is. So I'm just going to save my file again. And I will actually delete the other movie clip that I already had here. Let me just go back up to scene 1 to do that. Okay. And once I'm here, let me just expand my timeline out. So I'm on the main timeline right now. Let's go to my selection tool, and I'll just relocate that. Because it's a movie clip, everything inside is going to come along with it, relatively speaking. Again, we'll just do a quick save here. And I will test the movie just to make sure that that sound works. Obviously, you haven't created the menu yet, but I just want to demonstrate that sound working. Actually, you know what? Inside of it, you can just hit your return key and it will play inside of the movie clip. So I'm not going to start at the beginning. I'm just going to go halfway through here and hit my return key. And I heard it fade out. I can hear it fade out. I probably could have gone a little farther back, but you did see it animating and ultimately completing it. And if you want, you can just scrub through and watch it that way. And you see, as I'm moving, it is shrinking because I'm going backwards. Okay, so that's the idea there. I'm going to go back up to scene 1 here. So that's how we created the progress bar with the song. And again, it's contained in its own movie clip. And that movie clip sits in its own layer on the scene 1 timeline.